We need a collection of classic texts of the humanities, I think, because we have such things and we don't even stop to consider that they already exist for the sciences, especially the natural sciences, for social sciences. But they've never existed for the humanities, partly because I suppose they haven't been felt to be needed. We go about our practice, we broadly know what we're doing. We've had a big movement towards theoretical conceptualization of our fields from the 1980s and 1990s. And the aftermath of that. But it's actually only in recent years that we started to think about what the institutional and practical history, as in the history of practice, in the humanities has been. And there is a real absence of a concentrated literature on that. So I don't think there can be any kind of canonical set of texts for it, but what we're trying to do here is to figure out what would be the most interesting sample text, if you like. It can only be a sampling, I think, that would show us what has been the just consistent, remarkably continuous practice of people thinking about those disciplinary objects and methods that come within the broad range of the humanities. I've chosen John Stuart Mill's inaugural address as rector of St Andrews. So he was appointed to that role in 1866, and in 1867 he comes up to the university and speaks to the students who've elected him and to their teachers behind them. It has the status of being one of the great, and it is one of the great documents setting out what a liberal education should involve, how broad it can be, how deep it is, what principles it will be based upon. I strongly suspect that it's a text that's invoked much more often than it's read. To be frank, it's not the most lively of texts. He wasn't the most charismatic of speakers. There are very funny accounts which are very respectful, but a bit daunting when you take them at a distance. He spoke for between 2.5 and 3 hours in this small hall. The text, really tiny print, runs to 31 pages. So it's a kind of dogged, remorseless, that's the wrong word, that's too pejorative, but a really determined attempt to get to grips with what the principles and the underpinning and the aim, not just of a higher education should be, but of education right through your life. I love it. Martha Nussbaum has said it is one of the documents of higher education she most loves, this wonderful document, she calls it. And what I wanted to do in choosing it was to give it a kind of shaping or a framing in the history of humanities, because it emerges at exactly the point when most people will tell you the humanities are becoming much more specialized, more refined in their disciplinary aims and methods. And in fact, he enters that debate with an absolutely determined attempt to broaden things out again, to widen them, and to keep the humanities at the heart of a practice of education that runs right across all the domains of the modern university, so that it includes the natural sciences, the sciences, law, medicine, and so forth. And what he's really doing is thinking about a kind of reflective practice of a comparative interest in how we describe things, how we think about them, that would unmoor you from your conventions or habits for doing those things. So one of the pieces I'm drawing attention to is just a very simple passage where he quotes Hobbes on words being counters for things, not the things themselves. And he just asks you to think from the bottom up about what your experience is the first time you encounter a different language or a different culture when you're a child or a young person, and how that is sometimes your first, but certainly for all of us, a really important way of dislocating ourselves from the ways in which we've just been channeled to thinking by habit, by family, by social situation, and so forth. So it's, in its basic premises, it's very, very simple, but then it builds in complexity and difficulty, and it creates in front of you the kind of architecture of what a really complete education would look like. It partly interests me that people, even at the time, said this is really ambitious, but they didn't think it was impossible. And if you look at the newspaper coverage of that lecture, there are quite a few people, Pall Mall Gazette is a very good example, saying this is doable, and we shouldn't just write it off as an exemplary model from a man who was kind of impossibly brilliant in his own right and not to be emulated by the rest of us. It's doable. And we just need the institutional drive to create the right frame for it. Many people come to the value of the humanities as a topic or as a subject for inquiry is that they feel that it's under attack, and whether that's because the particular political scenario or cultural scenario they sit within, or their own family scenario, whatever it is difficult for them. They feel that they need to be able to articulate exactly what the added value of studying humanities rather than social sciences or some more practical course of education would be. But it's not the only reason. I actually think there's a connection here with John Stuart Mill, maybe, that it's a good thing for all of us to be able to articulate to ourselves clearly and robustly what the thing is that we're studying and why there is value for ourselves and for others in doing that. So I came to the Value of the Humanities book, the project, at a time when the introduction of higher education fees in Britain was making a lot of students worry about how to defend themselves. And often there wasn't actually an external attacker, but there was a kind of hypothesis of skepticism about, if you like, and they felt that they needed to be able to articulate it. When I was asked the question, my partner used to work in media and journalism, and he has the habit of asking hard questions over dinner. So what's your defense of the humanities? And I wasn't very happy with my automatic responses, and I did fall back pretty quickly on critical intelligence, ability to think about language, some kind of sensitivity towards history and historical change. And most obviously in that context, Martha Nussbaum's book was recently out, The Democracy Needs This Defense. And as I was putting those arguments out there, for one thing, there's something about repeating other people's arguments that always makes them feel a bit stale and secondhand to oneself. You need to make them new for yourself. So that would be my advice to anybody out there, to do that. Think it through for yourself rather than adopting someone else's arguments. My main response was, well, there is no one knockdown killer argument if you think somebody's hostile to your position. But there wouldn't be, that's going to be a bad argument in any context, is that the arguments that you use are going to depend upon the angle you're coming from and what your expectation of resistance is going to be. So if you're thinking, in the first instance, it seems to me quite important to think about just what is the content. We do a job like everybody else. So the very first part of the book I wrote is really just a description of what the discipline entails, how it is like and unlike other disciplines, and what kind of description of it do we need in, let's say, normative circumstances when we can just assume we go about our jobs as usual. Is there a different kind of harder-edged, sharper definition that we might need if we have to be a bit more robust and push back against assumptions that it is, doesn't earn its keep, for example, in the economy or that kind of thing. And then I just wanted to push through other lines of possible attack and therefore, necessary defense or just description, in a tamer environment. What are its uses? Where do we sit in relation to arguments from use and use value, utility? What does it have? What contribution does the study of humanities make to our ability to be happy, or as I prefer to phrase it, working with Mill again as it happens, to our understanding of what happiness is and how best we might, through education, put ourselves in the way of happiness? No guarantees. Then the democracy argument, and finally the one that a lot of people come to rest on, which is why I wanted to put it last. Is there such a thing as an intrinsic value to the content of the humanities? And what would it mean to want to hold that argument if you accept, as nearly all of us would, that the content of culture changes and sometimes changes quite radically over time and is certainly changing around us at the moment? So what you end up with is, I think, necessarily a pluralistic argument. They are often descriptions rather than arguments, but I've tried to present them in such a way that they can be re-geared if you do feel under attack. They can be harder edged, and if you don't, if you really feel that you're in quite a good place, then they're just descriptions to work with and to finesse.